In the most enigmatic corners of the world, where dreams weave seamlessly into reality, an ancient legend speaks of a hidden valley cradled between timeless mountains. It is said that within this valley lies a secret preserved for centuries, awaiting discovery by those who possess a brave heart and an open mind. On a starlit night, a man with silver hair and shimmering eyes sets forth toward this legendary valley. His name is Russell H. Conwell, a seeker of wisdom and tireless explorer of universal truths. With every step he takes, the echoes of forgotten stories reverberate through the stone walls that encircle him. Beneath the moon's gentle glow, Conwell uncovers an ancient manuscript, delicately wrapped in silk and stardust. It contains the lost account of a fearless traveler who, centuries ago, unearthed a treasure more valuable than gold, the acres of diamonds. Yet these diamonds are not mere gemstones. They are brilliant ideas that gleam with the promise of prosperity and personal fulfillment. With a voice that resonates like the murmurs of an ancestral river, Conwell unveils a map to greatness. He beckons us on a journey of self-discovery and triumph, where each word serves as a spark, igniting the passion to chase our most cherished dreams. In his tales, the mountains breathe life into stories of unsung heroes who discovered fortune where others saw only challenges. Listen closely, dear listener, as the wind whispers ancient secrets and the fire crackles with the promise of a bright future. Join us on this expedition through the acres of diamonds, where the magic of imagination meets timeless wisdom. Prepare to uncover not only material riches, but the true gem that resides within every person, the power to transform dreams into reality. Welcome to a text that transcends the boundaries of time and space, where each word is a step closer to discovering your own hidden treasure. Here lies the story of the Acres of Diamonds, narrated by Russell H. Conwell, where the quest for greatness begins in the most unexpected place, within yourself. Many years ago, as I traveled down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers with a group of English travelers, I found myself under the guidance of an old Arab guide we had hired in Baghdad. I often thought that this guide resembled our barbers, particularly in some mental characteristics. He believed it was not only his duty to guide us along these rivers and do what he was paid for, but also to entertain us with curious and rare stories, both ancient and modern, strange and familiar. Many of them I have forgotten, and I am glad of it, although there is one that I will never forget. The old guide led my camel by the bridle along the banks of these ancient rivers, telling me story after story until I grew weary of his tales and ceased to listen. I never became irritated with this guide when he lost his temper at the moment I stopped listening, but I remember him taking off his Turkish cap and shaking it in a circle to get my attention. I could see him out of the corner of my eye, but I stubbornly refused to look directly at him, for fear he would start another story. However, although I am not a woman, I eventually looked, and as soon as I did, he launched directly into another story. He said, "Now I will tell you a story that I reserve for my special friends." When he emphasized the words special friends, I listened, and have always been glad that I did. In fact, I feel deeply grateful, because there are 1,674 young people who have been led to the university by this lecture, and who are also glad I listened. The old guide told me that there was once, not far from the Indus River, an ancient Persian named Ali Hafed. He said that Ali Hafed owned a very large farm, with orchards, fields of grain and gardens, that he had money invested at interest, and that he was a rich and satisfied man. He was content because he was rich, and he was rich because he was content. One day, one of those ancient Buddhist priests, one of the wise men of the East, visited this old Persian farmer. He sat down by the fire, and the old farmer told him how this world was created. He said that this world was once a simple blanket of fog, and that the Almighty inserted his finger into it, starting to move it slowly, then faster and faster, until he transformed this blanket of fog into a solid ball of fire. Then it rolled through the universe, carving a path through other blankets of fog and condensing the exterior moisture until it fell in torrents of rain on its hot surface, cooling the outer crust. Then the internal fires bursting through the crust gave birth to the mountains, hills, valleys, plains, and prairies of this marvelous world. If this confused internal mass exploded and cooled very quickly, it became granite. With less speed, copper, silver, gold, and after gold, diamonds, said the old priest. A diamond is a drop of frozen sunlight. This is literally true from a scientific perspective. A diamond is a real deposit of carbon from the sun. The old priest told Ali Hafed that if he had a diamond the size of his thumb, he could buy the county, and that if he had a diamond mine, he could place his children on thrones of grace through the influence of his great wealth. Ali Hafed heard of diamonds and their great value, and that night he went to bed a poor man. He had lost nothing, but he was poor because he was discontented, and he felt that way because he feared being poor. He said, "I want a diamond mine." And he stayed awake all night. The next morning he sought out the priest. I know from experience that a priest gets very angry when you wake him up at that hour, and when Ali Hafed pulled that old priest from his dreams, he said to him, "Will you tell me where I can find diamonds?" "Diamonds? What do you want with diamonds?" "I want to become immensely rich." "Well, go find them. That's all you have to do. Go find them, and then you'll have them." "But I don't know where to go." "Well, if you find a river that flows over white sands between high mountains, in those white sands you will always find diamonds." "I do not believe there is such a river." "Oh yes, there are many. All you have to do is go and find them, and then you will have them." "I will go," said Ali Hafed. So he sold his farm, gathered his money, left his family in the care of a neighbor, and set off in search of diamonds. He began his search quite appropriately, in my opinion, in the mountains of the moon. Then he came to Palestine, wandered through Europe, and finally, when his money was spent and he was in rags, in misery and poverty, he found himself on the shore of the Bay of Barcelona in Spain. When the great tide came in between the pillars of Hercules, the poor afflicted man, suffering and dying, could not resist the terrible temptation to throw himself into that rising tide, and he sank beneath its foamy crest, to never rise again in this life. When that old guide told me this terribly sad story, he stopped the camel I was riding and turned to adjust the luggage that was coming loose from another camel, giving me the chance to reflect on his tale. While he was gone, I remember telling myself, why does he reserve this story for his special friends? It seemed to have no beginning, middle, or end, nothing. It was the first story I had ever heard where the hero died in the first chapter. There was only one chapter in this story, and the hero was already dead. When the guide returned and took the reins of my camel again, he continued the story to the second chapter, as if there had been no interruption. The man who had bought Ali Hafed's farm one day led his camel into the garden to drink, and when that camel dipped its muzzle into the shallow waters of the garden stream, Ali Hafed's successor caught sight of a glimmer of light in the white sands of the stream. He pulled out a black stone with an eye of light that reflected all the hues of the rainbow. He brought the stone home and placed it on the mantelpiece, then forgot about it. A few days later, that same old priest came to visit Ali Hafed's successor. As soon as he opened the door to the parlor, he saw that gleam of light on the mantel and rushed forward, shouting, "Here is a diamond! Ali Hafed has come back!" "No, Ali Hafed has not come back, and this is not a diamond. It's just a stone we found right here in our garden." But the priest said, "I tell you, I recognize a diamond when I see one. I know this is a diamond." So together they rushed into that old garden and stirred the white sands with their fingers. And lo and behold, other gems more beautiful and more precious than the first emerged. This is how the Golconda diamond mine was discovered, the most magnificent diamond mine in all of human history, surpassing Kimberley, the Koh-i-Noor, and the Orloff of the crown jewels of England and Russia. The greatest diamonds on earth came from it, the guide told me. When that old Arab guide recounted the second chapter of his story, he took off his Turkish cap and spun it around in the air again to draw my attention to the moral. These Arab guides have morals in their stories, although they are not always moral. While swinging his cap, he said to me, if Ali Hafed had stayed home and dug in his own cellar, or under his own wheat fields, or in his own garden, instead of knowing misery, hunger, and death by suicide in a foreign land, he would have had acres of diamonds for every acre of that old farm. Yes, for every shovelful, gems would have appeared, gems that have since adorned the crowns of monarchs. When he added the moral to his story, I understood why he reserved it for his special friends. But I did not tell him what I saw. It was this old Arab's way of beating around the bush like a lawyer, indirectly saying what he did not dare to say directly. In his personal opinion, there was a young man who was then traveling on the Tigris who would be better off at home in America. I did not tell him that I could see that, but I did tell him that his story reminded me of another, and I quickly told it to him. I think I will tell it to you as well. I spoke to him about a man who owned a ranch in California in 1847. He learned that gold had been discovered in Southern California, and obsessed with gold, he sold his ranch to Colonel Sanders and left never to return. Colonel Shutter put a mill on a stream crossing the ranch and tried his luck. He brought home a bit of damp sand from the creek and panned it with his fingers in front of the fire. In that sand, a visitor saw the first bright flakes of real gold discovered in California. The man who had owned that ranch wanted gold and could have simply taken it. In fact, since then, $38 million worth of gold has been extracted from a few acres. About 8 years ago, I gave this lecture in a town that was on that property, and I was told that for years and years, 1/3 of the owners there extracted $120 worth of gold every 15 minutes, awake or asleep, without paying any taxes. You and I would appreciate such an income if we did not have to pay income tax. But a better illustration of this happened right here in Pennsylvania itself. If there is anything I love more than anything else in this state, it is to have one of those Pennsylvania German audiences in front of me and reveal this information to them. I enjoy that. There was a man who lived in Pennsylvania, not very different from the Silvanos you have seen, who owned a farm and did exactly what I would do with a farm if I had one in Pennsylvania. He sold it. But before selling it, he decided to secure himself a job by picking coal for his cousin, who was in the business in Canada, where oil was first discovered on this continent at that time, extracted from the streams. Thus, this Pennsylvania farmer wrote to his cousin to ask for a job. You see, my friends, this farmer was not exactly a stupid man. No, he was not. He did not leave his farm until he had something else to do. Among all the fools upon whom the stars shine, I do not know anyone worse than the man who leaves a job before he has found another. This especially pertains to my profession and has no reference to a man seeking divorce. When he wrote to his cousin asking for a job, the cousin replied, "I cannot recruit you because you know nothing about the oil business." Well, the old farmer said, "I will learn." With the most commendable zeal, characteristic of Temple University students, he set about studying the whole subject. He began by tracing back to the second day of God's creation, when this world was covered with a thick, rich vegetation that has since become the primitive layers of coal. He studied until he discovered that draining those rich coal deposits produced coal oil that was worth pumping. Then he discovered how it gushed from live wells. He continued to study until he knew everything about how to produce it and refine it. Now, he said in his letter to his cousin, "I understand the oil business." His cousin replied, "Very well, let's go." So he sold his farm according to the county records for $833 flat, not a penny more. Hardly had he left when the man who bought the property went out to fix the livestock trough. He discovered that the previous owner had left years before and had placed a board across the stream behind the barn, just under the surface of the water. The purpose of this board, at this acute angle across the stream, was to throw over a horrible residue that the livestock would not dare sniff. But with this board to throw everything to one side, the livestock drank below. Thus, this man who had gone to Canada had bottled up the same for 23 years, a flood of coal oil that the geologists of the state of Pennsylvania evaluated 10 years later at $100 million for our state. And 4 years ago, our geologists stated that the discovery was worth $1 billion for our state. No. The man who owned the land where the city of Titusville now stands and these valleys of Pressenville had studied the subject from the second day of God's creation to today. He studied it until he knew everything, and yet it is said that he sold it all for $833. I repeat, without rhyme or reason. But I need another example. I found it in Massachusetts, and I regret having done so because it is the state I come from. This young man from Massachusetts illustrates another aspect of my thought. He went to Yale University and studied mining and mineralogy. He became such a skilled mining engineer that he was hired by the university authorities to tutor students who were falling behind in their classes. During his last year, he earned $15 a week for this work. When he graduated, his salary jumped from $15 to $45 a week, and he was offered a chair. As soon as they did that, he went home to his mother. If this boy's salary had gone from $15 to $15.60, he would have stayed and been proud of the place. But when they raised it to $45 at once, he said, "Mother, I will not work for $45 a week. The idea that a man with a brain like mine works for $45 a week. Let's go to California and look for gold and silver mines and become immensely rich, he told his mother. Now, Charlie, it is as good to be happy as it is to be rich, replied Charlie, but it is also good to be rich and happy. They were both right. Since he was an only child and she a widow, of course she won. And they sold out in Massachusetts and, instead of going to California, they went to Wisconsin, where he started working for the Superior Copper Mining Company at $15 a week, but with the condition, in his contract, that he would have a share in any mine he discovered for the company. I don't think he ever discovered a mine, and if I look at the face of any shareholder in that copper company, they would have wished he had discovered one. I have friends who are not here because they couldn't afford a ticket if they had stock in that company at the time this young man worked there. This young man left there, and he was never heard from again. I do not know what became of him in his life, and I do not know if he discovered a mine or not, but I do not think he ever did. But I know the other end of the line. Hardly had he left the old farm before the owner who succeeded him went out to dig potatoes. The potatoes had already begun to grow in the ground when he bought the farm, and while the old farmer was bringing in a basket of potatoes, he held them very tightly between the ends of the stone wall. You know, in Massachusetts, most of our farms have stone walls, so we save a lot on gates to have a place to put the stones. When he held that basket so tightly, he set it down and dragged it from one side and pulled it from the other. And while he was dragging this basket, that farmer noticed in the upper corner and outside of that stone wall just beside the door a block of native silver, 8 inches square. This professor of mining, mineralogy and geology, who knew so much about the subject and who would not work for $45 a week, when he sold that farm in Massachusetts, sat right over that silver to close the deal. He was born on that property, grew up there, and had traveled back and forth rubbing the stone with his sleeve until it reflected his face and seemed to say, "Here below there are $100,000 to be taken," but he did not want to take it. He was in a house in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and there was no silver, and he did not know it because he was teaching mineralogy. My friends, this error is very universal, and why we should smile often, I wonder what became of him, I do not know at all. But I will tell you what I assume. As a Yankee, I assume he is sitting this evening by his fire with his friends gathered around him, and he is telling them something like, "Do you know that man Jones who lives in Philadelphia? Or have I heard of him? Do you know that man Jones who lives in Philadelphia?" Well, they did exactly the same thing I did, which spoils all the fun because you and I did exactly the same thing he did. We sit here laughing at him. He has more right to sit over there and laugh at us. I know I made the same mistakes. But of course, that makes no difference, because we are not waiting for that man to preach and practice too. When I come here tonight and look around this audience, I still see what I have seen continuously for these 50 years. Men who make precisely this same mistake. I would often like to see the younger ones, and I wish the academy were filled with our high school and secondary students tonight, and I would like to talk to them, although I would have preferred an audience like that because they are more likely. They have not grown up in their prejudices like we. They have not become accustomed to habits they cannot break, and they have not yet encountered defeat. And although that might do more good for an audience like that than for grown people, I will do my best with the material I have. I tell you that you have acres of diamonds in Philadelphia, where you live now. I went to see a prominent professor of mineralogy and asked him where he thought those diamonds came from. The professor took out the map of the geological formations of our continent and traced it. He said they either passed through the underlying carboniferous strata conducive to such production westward through Ohio and Mississippi, or with greater probability, they came eastward through Virginia to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. It is a fact that the diamonds were there because they were discovered, sold and transported there during the drift from a locality to the north. Now, who can say that a person who goes down with their drill in Philadelphia will not find a trace of a diamond mine still here? My friends, you cannot say that you are not sitting on one of the largest diamond mines in the world, because a diamond like that only comes from the most lucrative mines on earth. But that merely serves to illustrate my thought that I emphasized by saying that if you do not have real diamond mines, then now that the Queen of England has given the greatest praise ever bestowed upon an American woman for her dress, for she appeared with no jewelry at all at the last reception in England, she has nearly put an end to the use of diamonds anyway. All that would matter to her would be the few she would wear if she wanted to be modest. and the rest she would sell for money. Now, I repeat that the opportunity to become rich, to achieve great wealth, is here in Philadelphia, now within the reach of almost all the men and women who are listening to me speak tonight. And I mean exactly what I say. I did not come to this platform, even under these circumstances, to recite something. I came to tell you what I believe to be the truth in the eyes of God, and if the years of my life have served to acquire common sense, I know I am right. The men and women sitting here, who may have struggled to buy a ticket for this conference or this meeting tonight, have acres of diamonds within their reach, opportunities to become vastly rich. There has never been a place on earth better suited than Philadelphia today, and never in the history of the world has a poor man without capital had such an opportunity to become quickly and honestly wealthy as he has now in our city. I say that this is the truth, and I want you to accept it as such. Because if you think I came here simply to recite something, then it would be better if I were not here. I have no time to waste in such discussions, but to say the things I believe. And unless some of you become wealthy from what I say tonight, my time is wasted. I say that you must become wealthy, and it is your Christian and pious duty to become so. How many of my pious brothers tell me, you, a Christian minister, spend your time traveling the country advising young people to become rich, to make money? Yes, of course I do. And they tell me, how horrible. Why don't you preach the gospel instead of preaching how to make money? Because making money honestly is preaching the gospel. That's why the men who become rich can be the most honest you will meet in the community. But perhaps a young person here tonight says, I have been told all my life that if a person has money, they are very dishonest, dishonorable, petty, and despicable. My friend, that is why you do not have to hold such an idea about people. The foundation of your faith is completely wrong. Let me say here clearly and briefly, though subject to discussion for which I have no time here, 98 out of 100 rich men in America are honest. That's why money is entrusted to them. That's why they undertake great enterprises and find many people to work with them, because they are honest. Another young person says, sometimes I hear about men who have millions of dollars in dishonest ways. Yes, of course, and I do too, but they are so rare that newspapers talk about them all the time as news, until one gets the idea that all the other rich people became rich dishonestly. My friend, take me and drive me if you have a car into the suburbs of Philadelphia and introduce me to the people who own their homes in this great city, those beautiful houses with gardens and flowers, those magnificent residences so charming in their art. And I will introduce you to the best people, both in character and in business, in our city. And you know I will. A man is not really a man until he owns his own home, and those who own their homes become more honorable, honest, pure, true, frugal, and prudent because of their property. That a man has money, even in large quantities, is not an incongruity. We preach against greed, and you know that we do it from the pulpit, and often we preach against it so long and use terms about filthy profit so strongly that Christians get the idea that when we rise to the pulpit, we believe it is harmless for any man to have money until the collection basket passes by, and then we almost insult people because they do not give more money. The inconsistency of such doctrines, money is power, and it should be reasonably ambitious to obtain it, for you can do more good with it than without it. Money prints its own Bible, money builds its churches, money sends its missionaries, and money pays its preachers, and they would not have much if they were not paid. I am always ready for my church to raise my salary, because the church that pays the highest salary does it more easily. You have never known an exception in your life. The man who receives the highest salary can do the most good with the power given to him. Of course he can, if his mind is right to use it properly. So I say you should have money if you can achieve wealth honestly in Philadelphia. It is your Christian and pious duty to do so. It is a grave mistake to think that one must be terribly poor to be pious. Some say they do not sympathize with the poor. Of course they do. Otherwise, I would not have been giving lectures all these years. I do not sympathize with the poor, but the number of poor people with whom to sympathize is very small. To sympathize with a man whom God has punished for his sins, and therefore to help him while God continues with just punishment, is certainly wrong, and we do more of that than we do of helping those who deserve it. However, we must have pity for God's poor, meaning those who cannot help themselves. Let's not forget that there is no poor person in the United States who has been made poor by their own fault, or by the fault of someone else. In any case, it is a mistake to be poor. I give this argument and leave it aside. A man stands up over there and says, "Don't you think there are some things in this world that are better than money?" Of course there are, but now I am talking about money. Of course there are certain things higher than money, or I know there are certain things in this world that are higher and sweeter and purer than money. Of course, I know there are certain things greater and grander than gold. Love is the grandest thing in the world of God, but blessed is the beloved who has a lot of money, even if they had reason to think, "She earns all the money that comes into this house, and he smokes some of it on the porch." I do not want to see any more of the Lord's poor of that kind, and I don't think the Lord wants that either. Yet there are people who think one must be terribly poor and dirty to be pious. That does not happen at all. Even if we have sympathy for the poor, let's not propagate such a doctrine. But the time is prejudiced to advise a Christian man, as a Jew would to a pious man, to reach for wealth. The prejudice is so universal, and the years go back far enough, I believe, to safely mention that years ago, at the time of university, there was a young man in our theology school who thought he was the only pious student in that department. One afternoon he came into my office, sat next to my desk and told me, "Mr. President, I think it is my duty, sir, to enter and work with you," he said. "I heard you say at the academy, at the inauguration of the Pierce School, that I thought it was an honorable ambition for a young man to desire wealth, and that I believed it made him sober, made him eager to make a good name, and made him industrious. I speak of how a man's ambition for money contributes to making him good. Sir, I came to tell you that the Holy Bible says that the love of money is the root of all evil." I told him that I had never seen that in the Bible, and I advised him to go to the chapel to look for the Bible and show me the place. So he went to find the Bible, and quickly returned to my office with the book open, with all the intolerant pride of a narrow sectarian or someone who bases their Christianity on a misinterpretation of the Scriptures. He placed the Bible on my desk and shouted in my ear, "Here it is, Mr. President, you can read it for yourself." I told him, "Well, young man, you will learn when you are a little older that you cannot count on another denomination to read the Bible for you. You belong to another denomination. However, in theology school you are taught that the emphasis is on exegesis. Now, you will take this Bible and read it yourself and give it the proper emphasis." He took the Bible and read proudly, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." So he was right, and when one correctly cites this old book even, one cites absolute truth. I have lived through 50 years of the greatest battle that this old book has ever waged, and I have lived to see its standards freely float, because never in the history of this world have the great minds of the earth been so universally agreed to say that the Bible is absolutely true as they are at this very moment. That is why I say that when I correctly quote, of course I am quoting absolute truth. The love of money is the root of all evil. Whoever seeks it too quickly or dishonestly will fall into many traps, there is no doubt. What is the love of money? It is making an idol of money, and simple idolatry is condemned everywhere by the Holy Scriptures and by human common sense. The man who worships money instead of reflecting on the ends for which it should be used, the man who simply idolizes money, the miser who hoards his money in the basement or hides it in his sock, or refuses to invest it where it could do good for the world, that man who clutches the dollar so tightly that the eagle groans, has in him the root of all evil. I think I will leave that behind now and answer the question that most of you are asking, is there an opportunity to get rich in Philadelphia? Well, it is easy to see where it is, and as soon as you see where it is yours. An old man stands up there and says, "Mr. Conwell, you have lived in Philadelphia for 31 years and you don't know that it is too late to do anything in this city?" No, I don't think that's true. I've tried. What have you devoted yourself to? I held a store here for 20 years, and I never made more than $1,000 in 20 years. Well, you can then measure what that has been for this city, what this city has paid you, for a man can judge his worth by what he receives, that is, by what he is to the world at this moment. If you haven't earned more than $1,000 in 20 years in Philadelphia, it would have been better for Philadelphia to have expelled you from the city 19 years and 9 months ago. A man has no right to own a store in Philadelphia for 20 years and not earn at least $500,000, even if it is a small neighborhood store. You say you can't earn $5,000 in a store now. My friends, if only you would take 4 blocks around you and discover what people want and what you should provide them, and you wrote it down with your pencil and calculated the profits you would gain if you provided it, you would soon see it. Wealth is within earshot. Someone says you don't know anything about business. A preacher never knows anything about business. Well, I'm going to have to prove that I'm an expert. I don't like doing this, but I must, otherwise my testimony won't be taken seriously. My father had a store in the country, and if there is a place under the stars where a man acquires all sorts of experiences, in all kinds of business transactions, it's in the country store. I am not proud of my experience, but sometimes when my father was away, he entrusted me with the responsibility of the store. Fortunately for him, that didn't happen very often, but it did happen often, my friends. A man would come into the store and ask me, "Do you have knives?" "No, we don't have knives." And I would walk away whistling a tune that I didn't care about. Then another farmer would come in and ask, "Do you have knives?" "No, we don't have knives," and I would play another melody. A third man entered through the same door and said, "Do you have knives?" "No, because everyone is asking for knives." Do you suppose we have this store to provide knives to the whole neighborhood? This is how it is in Philadelphia. The difficulty was that I hadn't yet learned that the foundation of piety and the fundamental principle of success in business are exactly the same. If a man says, "I can't bring my religion into business," he declares himself a fool in business, on the road to bankruptcy, or as a thief. One of the 3 will surely fail in a very few years if he does not carry his religion into business. If I had run my father's store with a Christian plan, a pious plan, I would have had a knife for the third man when he asked for it. Then I would have truly rendered him a service, and I would have received a reward that it would have been my duty to accept. There are Christians who are too pious, who think that if you profit from what you sell, you are unjust. On the contrary, it would be criminal to sell goods for less than their value. You have no right to do that. You cannot entrust your money to a man who cannot manage his own. You cannot trust a man in your family who is not faithful to his own wife. You cannot trust a man in the world who does not start with his own heart, his own character, and his own life. It would have been my duty to provide a knife for the third man, or for the second, and sell it to them, and benefit from it. I have no more right to sell goods without profiting from them than to charge them dishonestly more than they are worth. But I must sell each good in such a way that the person to whom I sell it gains as much as I do. Live and let live is the principle of the gospel, the principle of everyday common sense. And young man, listen to me. Live day by day. Don't expect to reach my age before starting to enjoy this life a little. If I were to get back the millions or even 50 cents that I have tried to earn all these years, it wouldn't do me as much good as what it does for me now, in this almost sacred presence of this evening. Oh yes, tonight I am rewarded time and time again for having shared as I have tried to do, to some extent over the years. I shouldn't speak like this, it sounds selfish, but I am old enough for you to forgive me for that. I should have helped my fellow men, which I have tried to do and which everyone should try to do, and derive happiness from it. The man who goes home feeling he stole $1 that day, having deprived a man of what he honestly deserved, will not have a peaceful sleep. He wakes up tired the next morning and goes to work with a weight on his conscience. He is not a successful man at all, even if he has accumulated millions. But the man who has passed through life always sharing with his fellow men, asserting and obtaining his own rights and privileges, and granting to all others their rights and privileges lives every day. And not only that, but it is the way to true wealth. The history of thousands of millionaires proves it. The man over there who said he couldn't do anything in a Philadelphia store has managed his store on a wrong principle. Suppose tomorrow morning I go to his store and ask him, "Do you know your neighbor who lives 1 block away at house number 1200 to 40? Yes, I know him. And where does he come from? From the store at the corner of the street? I don't know. How many are there in his family? I don't know. Who does he vote for? I don't know. Which church does he go to? I don't know, and I don't care. Why are you asking all these questions? If you had a store in Philadelphia, he would respond, it would be this way. Then you conduct your business in the same way I managed my father's in Washington, Massachusetts. You don't know where your neighbor came from when he moved to Philadelphia, and you don't care. If it had mattered to you, you would be a rich man now. If you had cared enough about him to be interested in his business, to discover what he needs, you would be rich. But you wander the world saying there is no opportunity to get rich, and the fault is right at your doorstep. But another young man stands up and says, "I cannot dedicate myself to business. Although I speak of business, this applies to any occupation because I have no capital." The weak and foolish creature who cannot see beyond his own neck is a sight to behold, these little types standing in corners and saying, "If I had a lot of capital, how rich I would be." Young man, do you believe you will become rich with capital? Certainly. Well, I certainly say no. If your mother has a lot of money and you go into business, you will use her money to get started. The moment a young man or woman acquires more money than they could obtain through practical experience, at that moment they have received a curse. It is not a help for a young man or woman to inherit money. It is not a help for your children to leave them money, but to leave them an education, a Christian and noble character, a wide circle of friends, an honorable name. That is far better than having money. It would be worse for them, worse for the nation, if they had a little money. Young man, if you have inherited money, do not consider it an aid. Think through your years and it will deprive you of the best things in human life. There is no class of people who should be pitied as much as the inexperienced sons and daughters of the wealthy in our generation. I pity the rich man's child. He will never know the best things in life. One of the best things in our lives is when a young man earns his living himself, and when he becomes engaged to a charming young woman and decides to start a home. So, with that same love comes also that divine inspiration towards better things. He begins to save his money, to abandon his bad habits, and to put money in the bank. When he has a few $100s, he goes to the suburbs in search of a home. He goes to the savings bank perhaps for half its value, and then he goes to fetch his wife. When he brings his fiancée to the threshold of that door for the first time, he says with words of eloquence that my voice can never equal, "I have earned this home myself, it is entirely mine, and I share it with you." That is the grandest moment a human heart can know. But the son of a rich man can never know this. He brings his fiancée to a more refined mansion, perhaps, but he is obliged to show her around, saying, "My mother gave me this, my mother gave me that, my mother gave me this," until his wife wishes she had married his mother. I pity the rich man's son. Statistics from Massachusetts have shown that one son of a rich man in 17 dies rich. I pity the sons of the wealthy, unless they have the good sense of the great Vanderbilt, who one day addressed his father and said, "You earned all your money." I did, my son. I started working on a ferry for 25 cents a day. "Then," said his son, "I will have none of your money." He also tried to find a job on a ferry that Saturday night, but he could not. He found a position at $3 a week. Of course, if the son of a wealthy man does that, he acquires the discipline of a poor child, which is better than a university education for any man. Then he would be capable of managing his father's millions. But as a general rule, rich men do not allow their children to do what made them great. As a rule, the wealthy man will not allow his son to work, and his mother will think it a social shame that her poor and weak son, with his lily fingers, has to earn a living honestly. I do not pity the sons of these rich men. I remember one at Niagara Falls. I think I remember another much closer. I believe there are gentlemen here present who are attending a grand banquet. I beg pardon from his friends at a banquet here in Philadelphia. By my side, a young man with a good heart said to me, "Mr. Conwell, you have been ill for 2 or 3 years. When you come out, take my limousine, and it will take you home, Broad Street." I thanked him very much. Perhaps I should not mention the incident this way, but I stick to the facts. I settled into the driver's seat of that limousine outside, and as we were driving, I asked the driver how much that limousine had cost. $6,800, and we had to pay tax on it, he replied. "Well," I said, "does the owner of this machine ever drive it himself?" The driver laughed so hard that he lost control of the machine. Surprised by my question, he quickly went up on the sidewalk and grazed the lamppost at the corner while coming back out into the street. When he returned to the road, he laughed so hard that all the machinery shook. "Drive this machine? You'd be lucky if I knew enough to get out when we arrive." I must tell you about the son of a rich man at Niagara Falls. I arrived at the hotel after the conference, and when I approached the counter, there was the son of a millionaire from New York, an indescribable specimen of anthropological power. He was wearing a side skull cap with a golden ball on top, and a golden-headed cane under his arm, more content in his head than in his mind. It was very difficult to describe this young man. He wore glasses through which he could not see, patent leather boots with which he could not walk, and trousers with which he could not sit. He was dressed like a grasshopper. This human cricket approached the clerk's counter just as I entered. He adjusted his glasses, which he could not see through, and said to the clerk, "You see, I thought I was English, you know. I wish you would kindly provide me with some paper and envelopes." The hotel employee quickly handed him the envelopes and paper, pulling them from a drawer and throwing them across the counter towards the young man, then returned to his books. You should have seen this young man when those envelopes reached the counter. He puffed up like a domestic turkey, adjusted his glasses, which he could not see through, and shouted, "Bring them back here now, I tell you. Dare take that paper and envelope away from me. Over there in Willows there is a text about the poor, miserable and contemptible American monkey." He could not take paper and envelope 6 feet away, I suppose. He could not lower his arms to do so. I have no compassion for such parodies of human nature. If you have no capital, young man, I rejoice for you. What you need is common sense. The penny. The best thing I can do is illustrate with well-known real facts from everyone here. Stuart, a poor boy from New York, had $1.50 to start in life. He lost 87 cents and a half of that in his first venture. What luck for this young man to lose the first time he gambled. This boy said, "I will never gamble again in business," and he never did. How he managed to lose 87 and a half cents, you probably all know the story. How he lost them because he bought some needles, threads and buttons to sell that people didn't want. And he found himself stuck with them, an irretrievable loss, the boy said. "I will never lose money that way again." So he first went door to door asking people what they wanted. Then, when he knew what they wanted, he invested his 62 and a half cents to satisfy a known demand. Study it anywhere you choose. In business, in your profession, in household tasks, whatever your life may be, that is the secret of success. First know the demand, first know what people need, then invest in what they need most. Andrew Stewart followed this principle until he became the owner of the same shop where Mr. Ganamaker does his big business in New York. His fortune was made by losing something that taught him a great lesson, that one should only invest in oneself or in one's money, in something that people need. When will they learn, you merchants? When will they learn, you manufacturers, that they must know the changing needs of humanity if they want to succeed in life? Apply yourselves all, Christians, as manufacturers and merchants or workers, to meet that human need. It is a great principle, as broad as humanity and as deep as Scripture itself. The best illustration I have heard is that of John Jacob Astor. You know he made a fortune for the Astor family when he lived in New York, crossing the ocean in debt for his passage. But this poor boy, with not a dime in his pocket, made a fortune for the Astor family according to one principle. Someone young here tonight will say, "Well, they were able to make these fortunes in New York, but they couldn't do it in Philadelphia." My friends, have you ever read that wonderful book by Ruiz? Our memory of it is sweet because of his recent death, in which he offers a statistical account of the records taken in 1889 of 107 millionaires from New York. If you read the account, you will see that out of the 107 millionaires, only 7 made their money in New York. Out of the 107 millionaires with $10 million in real estate, 67 of them made their money in towns with fewer than 3,500 inhabitants. The richest man in this country today, if we examine property values, has never left a town of 3,500 inhabitants. It doesn't matter where you are or who you are, but if you can't become rich in Philadelphia, you certainly can't in New York. Now, John Jacob Astor illustrates what can be achieved anywhere. He once had a mortgage on a hat store and couldn't sell enough hats to pay the interest on his money. So he seized the mortgage, took possession of the store, and partnered with the same people, in the same store, with the same capital. He didn't give them $1 of capital. They had to sell products to get money. Then he left them alone in the store as before, and he went out to sit on a park bench in the shade. What was John Jacob Astor doing there? Partnering with people who had failed in their hands. He had in his hands the most important, and in my opinion the most enjoyable part of that partnership, because while John Jacob Astor was sitting on that bench, he was observing the ladies who passed by. Where is the man who wouldn't become rich in that business while he was sitting on the bench, and a lady passed by him, shoulders back, head held high, looking straight ahead, as if she didn't care that everyone was watching her? Then he studied her hat, and when she was out of sight, he knew the shape of the hat, the color of the ornaments, and the folds of the feather. Sometimes he tried to describe a hat, but he couldn't always. He wouldn't try to describe a modern hat. Where is the man who could describe one? It was a collection of all sorts of driftwood glued to the back of the neck or on the side of a collar, or like a rooster with only one tail feather. But in John Jacob Astor's time, there was art in the hat business. He went to the hat store and told them to showcase a hat like the one he described because he had already seen a lady who liked that hat. "Don't create anything else until I return," he told them. Then he went out and sat again, and another lady passed by him, of a different shape, a different complexion, with a different style and color of hat. "Now," he said, "with a hat like that in the window, I won't fill my city showcase with a mountain of hats and bonnets to drive people away." Then he sat on the back steps to complain because people were going to Astoria's showcase to do business. There wasn't a hat or bonnet more than what the lady liked before she invented the tide of fashion. He immediately started turning, and that was the foundation of the largest store in New York. In that lineage, it still exists as one of the 3 boutiques. His fortune was made by John Jacob Astor after failing in business by not giving them more money, but by discovering what ladies liked for their hats, before wasting any material in their making. I tell you that if a man could foresee the hat business, he could foresee anything under the sky. Let's suppose tonight I am addressing this audience, and I ask them in this great manufacturing city if there are still opportunities to become rich in manufacturing. If a young man still answers, "There are opportunities here if you invest in real estate," and have $2 or $3 million to start as young capital. The story of the collapse of real estate due to this attack on big business only illustrates what the opportunity is now for the smallest man. There has never been a time in the history of the world when one could become rich as quickly in manufacturing without capital as now. But you will say, "You can't do any of that. You can't start without capital, young one." Allow me to illustrate for a moment. I must do it. It is my duty to every young man and every young woman, for we will all soon enter into business according to the same young plan. Remember, if you know what people need, you have acquired more knowledge to make a fortune than any sum of capital can give you. There was a poor man without work who lived in Ehan, Massachusetts. He lounged around the house until his wife told him to go out and work, and since they lived in Massachusetts, he obeyed his wife. He went out and sat by the bay, and he carved a wet tile to make a wooden chain. That evening, his children fought over it, and he carved a second one to keep the peace. While he was carving the second, a neighbor came in and said to him, "Why not carve toys and sell them? You could make money that way." He replied, "I wouldn't know what to do." The neighbor said to him, "Why not ask your own children here at home what they think?" "What good would that do?" said the carpenter. "My children are different from other people's." I often saw people like that when I was teaching school, but he followed the suggestion. The next morning, when Maria came down the stairs, he asked her what she wanted as a toy. She began telling him that she wanted a dollhouse, a toy sink, a doll carriage, an umbrella, and continued with a list of things that would take him a lifetime to provide. So by consulting his own children at home, he took some wood since he had no money to buy wood, and he carved those sturdy unpainted Ingham toys that became famous worldwide for many years. That man started making these toys for his own children. Then he made copies and sold them in the neighboring boot and shoe stores. He began to make a little money, then a little more. Mr. Lawson, in his financial frenzy, says this man is the richest in old Massachusetts, and I think that's true. This man is worth $100 million today, and he started only 34 years ago based on this unique principle, judging that what his own children loved at home, other people's children would also love in their homes. Judging human hearts by oneself, by one's wife, or by one's children is the royal road to success in manufacturing. But he had no capital. One might ask if he even had a knife, but I don't know if he had paid for it. He spoke this way to an audience in New Britain, Connecticut, and a lady who was 400 seats away went home and tried to remove the collar from her shirt, and the collar button got stuck in the buttonhole. She pulled it and said, "I'm going to find something better than this for putting on collars." Her husband said, after what she had said with Wen that night, "You see, we need an improved collar, easier to handle. There's a human need. There's a great fortune now." So he designed a collar button, and he became rich. She mocked him, and therefore she mocked me. It's one of the saddest things that sometimes hangs over me like a deep midnight cloud, even though I have worked so hard for over half a century. Yet how little have I actually accomplished, despite the greatness and beauty of his compliment this evening. I sincerely don't think 1 in 10 of you will earn $1 million for being here tonight, but it's not my fault. It's yours. What's the point of speaking this way if people never do what I advise? When her husband mocked her, she decided to make a better collar button. When a woman resolves to do it and says nothing about it, it was this New England woman who invented the snap button that can now be found everywhere. First, it was a collar button with a spring cover attached on the outside. Those of you who wear modern raincoats know this button that simply snaps shut and comes undone with a simple click. That's the button I'm talking about, and she invented it. Then, she invented other buttons, invested more, and ended up partnering with large factories. Now this woman crosses the ocean every summer on her own private steamship, and she takes her husband with her. If her husband were to die, she would have enough money to buy a duke or a foreign count, or some similar title, according to the latest news. What is my lesson in this incident, I told her then, though I didn't know her, what I'm now telling you. Her wealth was too close. She was looking over it. She needed to look closer because it was right under her chin. I read in the newspaper that a woman had never invented anything. Well, that newspaper should start from scratch. Of course, I'm talking about gossip. I'm talking about machines, and if it did, it would be better to include men. That newspaper could never be published if women hadn't invented something. Friends, think. Women, think. They say they can't get rich because they work in a laundry or use a sewing machine. Perhaps, or they walk in front of a weaving loom, and yet they can become millionaires by following this almost infallible path. When you say a woman doesn't invent anything, I ask, who invented the jacquard loom that wove all the fabrics you wear? Mrs. Jacquard. The printing roller, the press, were invented by farmers' wives. Who invented the southern cotton gin that enriched our country in an incredible way? General Greene's wife invented the cotton machine and showed the idea to Mr. Whitney, and he, as a man, exploited it. Who invented the sewing machine? If tomorrow I asked your children at school, they would say that Elias Howe was with me during the Civil War and was often in my shop. I often heard him say he worked for 14 years to get that sewing machine, but one day his wife decided they would starve if they didn't invent something quickly. In 2 hours, she invented the sewing machine. Of course, she took the patent in her name. Men always do that. Who invented the reaper and the mower? According to a confidential communication from Mr. McCormick published recently, it was a woman from West Virginia. After her father and himself failed to manufacture a reaper which they had abandoned, she took a bunch of shears and nailed them together on the edge of a board with an axle for the ground. Then she modified them so that when she pulled a cable on one side, they closed, and when she pulled the cable on the other side, they opened. That's how she discovered the principle of the reaper. If you look at a lawnmower, you'll see it's nothing more than a bunch of scissors. If a woman can invent a reaper, if a woman can invent a jacquard loom, if a woman can invent a cotton gin, if a woman can invent, as Mr. Carnegie said, the great iron presses that laid the foundation for all the steel millions in the United States, we men can invent anything under the stars. I say this to encourage the male group. Who are the great inventors of the world? Again, this lesson is presented to us. The great inventor is sitting next to you, or it is you yourself. You might say, I've never invented anything in my life. Great inventors haven't either until they discover a great secret. Do you think it's a man with a head like a bushel measure, or a man like a lightning bolt? It's neither of those things. The true great man is a simple, ordinary man with common sense. You could never guess he's a great inventor if there wasn't something he had really done. His neighbors don't consider him so great. They never see anything great beyond their fence. Everything is far away. His greatness is always so simple, so humble, so serious, so practical that neighbors and friends never recognize it. True greatness is often unrecognized, that's for sure. Nothing is known of the greatest men and women. I went out to write the life of General Garfield and a neighbor, knowing I was in a hurry and that there was a large crowd around the front door, took me to the back door of General Garfield and shouted, "Jim!" Soon, Jim came to the door and let me in. I wrote the biography of one of the greatest men in the nation, and yet he was still the same old Jim to his neighbor. If you knew a great man in Philadelphia and met him tomorrow, you would say, "How are you, Sam?" or, "Hello, Jim." Of course you would. That's exactly what you would do. One of my soldiers during the Civil War had been sentenced to death, and I went up to the White House in Washington, sent there for the first time in my life, to see the president. I entered the waiting room and sat on a bench with many others. The secretary was asking each what they wanted. Once the secretary finished with the pile, he went in, then came back to the door and beckoned me. I approached the vestibule, and the secretary said to me, "This is the president's door. Just knock and enter." Never in my life have I been so surprised, my friends, never. The secretary never put me in such a position, for he told me how to enter, then he went out through another door on the left and closed it. I was alone in the hallway, in front of the door of the President of the United States of America. I had been on battlefields where shells sometimes whistled, and bullets sometimes hit me, but I always wanted to run. I have no sympathy for an old man who says, "I would rather walk into the cannon than eat my dinner." I do not trust a man who does not know enough to be afraid when shot at. I have never been so scared as when the shells surrounded us at Gettysburg. But that day, when I entered that room, I found courage somehow, and I knocked at the door. The man inside didn't help me at all, but avoided my entrance by saying, "Come in and sit down." Well, I entered and sat on the edge of a chair, and he said he was in Europe. The man at the table didn't look up. He was one of the greatest men in the world, and he became great by a single rule. If all the young people in Philadelphia were in front of me now, and if I could say just one thing and they would remember it, I would give my whole life for the effect it would have on our city and on civilization. The principle of greatness of Abraham Lincoln can be adopted by almost everyone. Here is his rule. Whatever he had to do, he put his whole soul into it and continued until it was done. That is what makes men great almost everywhere. He clung to the papers on the table and did not look at me. I stood there trembling. Finally, when he had tied his cord around the papers, he shifted to the side and looked at me. A smile appearing on his tired face, he said to me, "I am very busy and have only a few minutes now. Tell me in a few words what you want." I began to tell him and mention the matter. He said, "I have heard it all. You don't need to say more. Mr. Stanton spoke to me about it just a few days ago. You can go to the hotel knowing that the President has never signed an order to shoot a boy under 20 years old, and he never will. Can you at least tell that to his mother? Anyway, how is everything going in the campaign?" he asked. "Sometimes we get discouraged," I said. "Everything is fine now. We are going to win. We are nearing the light. No man should desire to be President of the United States, and I will be glad when that day comes." "So that's it," he said. "We will be heading to Springfield, Illinois. I bought a farm there, and I don't mind if I only make 25 cents a day." "Does it have a team of mules?" "We are going to plant onions," he replied. "So I wonder, did you grow up on a farm in the hills of Behar, Massachusetts?" I replied. Then he put his leg on the corner of the big chair and said, "I have heard many times since my youth that you have to sharpen the noses of the sheep up there in those hills to get down to the grass between the rocks." It was so familiar, so everyday, so rural, that I felt right at home with him. Then he took another roll of paper, looked at me and said, "Good days." I understood the allusion, got up, and left. After I came out, I didn't realize I had seen the President of the United States. But a few days later, while I was still in town, I saw the crowd passing by the funeral home where the coffin of Abraham Lincoln was. When I looked at the lifted face of the assassinated president, I then felt that the man I had seen a little while before, so simple, so modest, was one of the greatest men God had raised to guide a nation toward ultimate freedom. Yet, to his neighbors, he was just an old bird. When the second funeral took place, I was invited, along with others, to see the same coffin placed back in the tomb in Springfield, surrounded by Lincoln's old neighbors for whom he was just an old bird. Of course, that's all they said. Have you ever seen a man who is supposed to be too great to be noticed as just a simple mechanic? Do you think he is great? He's just an inflated balloon supported by his big feet. There is no greatness in him. Who are the great men and women? The other day, I was reminded of the story of a little thing that made the fortune of a very poor man. It was terrible, and yet, thanks to this experience, the one who was neither a great inventor nor a genius invented the pin, now called the safety pin, and from that safety pin, he made the fortune of one of the great aristocratic families of this nation. A poor man from Massachusetts, who had worked in nail factories, injured himself at the age of 38 and could earn only a little money. He was employed in the office to erase the marks on the bills left by pencil memos. He used an eraser until his hand was tired. Then he attached a piece of rubber to the end of a stick and worked it like a plane. His little girl came up to him and said, "Hey, you have a patent." But the father replied, "No, my daughter. It was only later, when I took this stick and attached the rubber to the end, that I thought of a patent." He went to Boston and applied for a patent. Now each of you who has a pencil with an eraser on the end in your pocket pays tribute to the millionaire. He invested no capital, not even a cent. It all came back, up to millions. But let me move on to a greater thought. Show me the great men and women who live in Philadelphia. A gentleman will rise and say, "We have no great men in Philadelphia. They live elsewhere, in Rome or St. Petersburg, in London or Manajung, everywhere but here, in this city." Now I come to the peak of my thought, to the heart of the matter and the center of my struggle. Philadelphia is not a greater city because of its superior wealth, as New York surpasses Philadelphia, people say. Of course, many other cities in the United States surpass Philadelphia. But there is one answer. Our own people speak badly of their own city. If there ever was a community on earth that needs to be pushed forward, it is the city of Philadelphia. If we want a boulevard, they oppose it. If we want better schools, they oppose it. If we want smart legislation, they oppose it. They oppose all the best proposals. This is the only great mistake I can attribute to magnificent Philadelphia, which has been so kind to me. I say it is time to turn toward our city and start talking about the good things it possesses, as the inhabitants of Chicago, New York, St. Louis, and San Francisco do. If we could inspire this spirit among our people, the one who tells us that we can accomplish things in Philadelphia and accomplish them rightly, millions of Philadelphians would rise up, trust God and man, and believe in all the great opportunities that exist here, not just in New York or Boston, but here, for business and everything worth living for on earth. There has never been a greater opportunity. Let's talk about our own city. But there are two young men here tonight, and that is all I will venture to say, for it is too late. One of them will rise and say, "There will be a great man in Philadelphia, but there has never been one." This is how it goes when you should be great, when you are elected to a political office. You won't learn the lesson in the political manual, which is a prima facie evidence of smallness under our form of government. Sometimes great men achieve the highest offices, but what this country needs are men who will do what we tell them to do. This nation, where the people govern, is governed by the people, for the people. And as long as that is true, the office holder is nothing more than the servant of the people. And the Bible says that the servant cannot be greater than his master. The Bible says that the messenger cannot be greater than the one who sent him. The people govern, or should govern, and if they do, we don't need great men in charge. If the great men of the United States occupied our positions, we would become an empire in the next 10 years. I know many young women who, now that women's suffrage is coming, say, "One day I will be President of the United States. I believe in women's suffrage and there is no doubt that it will come. But anyway, I will step back. Perhaps I want a position for myself, but if the ambition for a position influences women in their desire to vote, I want to say right here what I tell young men. If you only get the privilege of voting, you get nothing worthwhile unless you can control more than one vote. You will be unknown, and your influence will be so minimal that it will be hardly noticeable. This country is not governed by votes. Do you think it is? It is governed by influence. It is governed by the ambitions and enterprises that control the votes. The young girl who thinks she will vote because she aspires to a position is making a serious mistake. Another young man stands up and says, "There will be great men in this country and in Philadelphia." This happens when a great war comes, when we have difficulties due to the vigilant wait in Mexico, when we go to war with England over some frivolity, or with Japan, China, New Jersey, or some distant country. Then I will march to the mouth of the cannon. I will defy the bright bayonets. I will leap into the arena and seize the flag that I will carry in triumph. I will return home with stars on my shoulder and occupy all the positions given by the nation, and I will be great. No, you will not be. Do you believe that a position will make you great? But remember that if you were not great before obtaining the position, you will not be when you have obtained it. It will only be a sham or in that form. We had a jubilee of peace here after the Spanish War in the West. They do not believe it because they say that Philadelphia had not heard of a Spanish war for 50 years. Some of you have seen the procession go up Broad Street. I was not there, but my family wrote to me that Lieutenant Hobson's carriage stopped right in front of the main door, and the people shouted, "Long live Hobson." If I had been there, I would have shouted too, because he deserves much more from his country than what he has received. Suppose I go to school and ask who sank Almerimar near Santiago. If the children answer Hobson, they will say 7/8 of a lie. There were 7 other heroes on that ship, and because of their positions they were constantly exposed to Spanish fire, while Hobson, as an officer, could reasonably only be behind the chimney. You have gathered in this house your most intelligent people, and yet perhaps none of those present could name the 7 other men. We should not teach history like this. We should teach that whatever the modesty of a man's position, if he fulfills his duty in that place, he has as much right to the honor of the American people as the king on his throne. But we do not teach that now. Everywhere we teach that it is the generals who do all the fighting. I remember that after the war, I went to visit General Robert Lee, that magnificent Christian gentleman whom the North and the South are now proud of as one of our great Americans. The general spoke to me about his servant Rastus, who was an enlisted African-American soldier. One day he called him over to tease him and said, "Rastus, all the others in your company are dead. Why aren't you dead too?" Rastus winked at him and replied, "Because when there's fighting, I stay back with the generals." I remember another example that I will omit, but when you go to the library to read this lecture, you will see that it has been printed there for 25 years. I close my eyes, really closed, and I see the faces of my youth. Sometimes I'm told, "Your hair is not white. You work day and night without ever seeming to stop. You can't be old." But when I close my eyes, like all men my age, then the dear and lost faces of the past return. No matter what people say, it is twilight now. I close my eyes and look toward my hometown in Massachusetts. I see the cattle exhibition field at the top of the mountain. I can see the barns over there. I can see the Congregational Church, see the town hall and the homes of the hill dwellers. I can see a large assembly of people going there, dressed splendidly. I can see the flags flying, the handkerchiefs waving, and hear the fanfares playing. I can see that company of soldiers who had re-enlisted, marching across the fairgrounds. I was just a child, but I was the captain of that company, and I was puffed with pride. A batiste needle had torn me to pieces. At that time, I thought it was the greatest event that could happen to a man on earth. If you ever thought of being a king or queen, go visit the mayor. The fanfares played and all the people gathered to welcome us. I proudly mounted to the front of my troops, and we went down to the town hall. There my soldiers were seated in the central hall, and I sat on the front seat. A great assembly of people, about 100 or 200, entered to fill the town hall, standing all around. Then the city officials arrived and formed a semicircle. The mayor of the city sat at the center of the platform. He was a man who had never held office, but he was good, as his friends had told me. May I use this without offending? He was good, but he thought that an office would enlarge a person. He rose and sat down, adjusting his big glasses and looking around. Suddenly, he saw me sitting there in front. He came forward to the podium and invited me to sit with the city officials. Before going to war, no city official had noticed me, except to advise the master to flay me. And now, I was invited to step onto the podium with the city officials. The mayor of the city was then the emperor, the king of our time. When I stepped onto the podium, I was given a chair about this distance, I would say, from the front. Once seated, the president of the council members rose and approached the table. We all knew that he would represent the minister of the congregation. He was the only speaker in the city, and he was going to give the speech to the returning soldiers. My friends, you should have seen the surprise that seized the audience when they realized that the old lady was not going to give the same speech. She had never given a speech in her life, but she made the same mistake that hundreds of other men have made. It seems so strange that a man does not learn to speak while growing up, if he pretends to become a speaker. But he seems to believe that all he has to do is occupy a position to become a great speaker. So he stepped up to the front and brought forth a speech he had memorized. Walking up and down in the grass where he had frightened the cattle, he brought the manuscript with him and laid it on the table to ensure he could give it. He adjusted his glasses, leaned over it for a moment, then stepped back onto the platform and then advanced. He must have studied the subject a lot, if you think about it, because he struck a cultured pose. He frequently leaned on his left heel, threw his shoulders back, slightly advanced his right foot, opened his speech organs and advanced his right foot at a 45-degree angle while maintaining this cultured posture. Friends, this is how the speech unfolded. Some will tell me not to exaggerate, that would be impossible. But I am here because of the election and not history, and so, citizens, as soon as he heard his voice, his fingers began to play, his knees began to tremble, then his whole body trembled. He choked and swallowed. then approached the table to look at the manuscript. Then he straightened himself with clenched fists and returned. "Citizens, we are very happy. We are very happy. We are very happy. We are very happy to welcome these soldiers back to their hometown, those who fought and bled and who return once again to their hometown. We are especially pleased to see with us today this young hero, this young hero whom we saw, imagining that he led his troops to the deadly breach. We saw his brilliance. We saw his brilliance, his shining sword glistening in the sun, while he shouted to his troops, 'Come on, my dear friends.' How little this good man knew of war. Had he known, he would have known what any of his fellow officers present would tell you, which is that it is almost a crime for an infantry officer to advance in front of his men in times of danger. Me, with my shining sword, gleaming in the sun, shouting to my troops, 'Come on, my dear friends.' I never did that. It is assumed that I would place myself in front of my men so that the enemy could shoot me from the front and my own men from behind. That is not the place for an officer. The place for the officer is in the true battle, behind the line. How many times as a staff officer did I go down to the line when our men were suddenly called to the battle line and the rebel shouts came out of the forest? I shouted, 'Officers to the rear, officers to the rear.' Then all the officers positioned themselves behind the line of seasoned soldiers. And the higher the rank of the officer, the further back he goes, not because he is less brave, but because the laws of war require it. Yet, with my shining sword, sitting in this house was the contingent of my soldiers who had brought this young boy back behind the rivers of Carolina so that he wouldn't get his feet wet. Some of them had gone far to get a pig or a chicken. Some had gone to die under the projectile-swept pines in the mountains of Tennessee. But in the good man's speech, they were hardly recognized. He mentioned them, but incidentally. The hero of the moment was this boy, saying something to the nation. Nothing then and nothing now, because he was simply the hero. Simply because this man fell into the same human error, that this boy was great because he was an officer, and these were only seasoned soldiers. So I learned the lesson that I will never forget as long as the tongue of the bell of time continues to toll. For me, greatness does not lie in the exercise of some future position, but it actually resides in the accomplishment of great works with few means and the realization of vast designs from the private ranks of life. To be great in everything, one must be so here and now in Philadelphia. Whoever can offer this city better streets and sidewalks, better schools and more colleges, more happiness and civilization, more God, will be great wherever they are. Let every man or woman here, even if they never listen to me again, remember this. If you want to be great in everything, you must start where you are, and what you are in Philadelphia right now. Whoever can bring a blessing to their city, whoever can be a good citizen as long as they live here, whoever can make homes better, whoever can be a blessing, whether working in a store, behind a counter, or keeping a home, whatever their life, whoever wants to be great in everything must first be great in their own Philadelphia,